I want you to imagine a scenario. Imagine that you're very sick and you go to your doctor. You tell them that you have a medical history of a surgery that is causing your current symptoms, a side effect of your past procedure. But instead of taking into your account your testimony of your previous surgery, illness, and condition, the doctor decides to treat you as though none of this ever happened, that it doesn't exist, telling you, well, there's no conceivable way that your previous surgery is giving you any problems whatsoever. The past is just the past. Imagine that your doctor even goes on to suggest that perhaps you're imagining your symptoms. Wouldn't that be frustrating? To have someone suggest that you're imagining your pain like I'm having you imagine this scenario? This is no way to treat an illness, but this is how most white Americans rationalize the systemic illness of racism in the United States. That despite our country's history of an entire economy predicated on the sale of Black people's bodies through slavery, legislation written into the Constitution that dictated that Black people were less than human in the 3/5 clause, despite the era of Jim Crow laws and segregation where it was overlooked to hang innocent people of color in the street. Much like the doctor who tells their patient that it is all in their head, most white Americans would rather insist that our country's past history has no bearing on our current society and that race is something that we should no longer discuss, rather than acknowledge the possibility that we still have work to do. Just a few facts that briefly cover how big of a problem racism still is. While people of color only make up about 13% of the total population today, they are 60% of the U.S. prison population, the largest prison population in the world. The Department of Justice has only just started to investigate the huge disparities in these percentages, and they're finding that historical racist law enforcement practices are mostly to blame. This becomes even more important when discussing things like nonviolent drug offenses, where people of color are jailed at much higher rates, even though drug use and sale in the white community is statistically higher than in the African American community. Numerous studies have shown that individuals with ethnic-sounding names are less likely to receive callbacks than their white counterparts. Studies also show that Black students are less likely than their white counterparts to be referred to gifted courses by their teachers, despite similar test scores. Young Black men particularly are at a higher risk for expulsion and disciplinary action, even though they commit the same misconduct as white students. So these are just a few examples of how we're still not treating people of color equitably in education, the job market, the justice system, and most of this is a result of an effort to erase historical practices that we refuse to speak about to save face. Like the eugenics movement, for example, which had the sole purpose of justifying the persecution of Black people by determining that they were a different species than white people. Many white Americans are still totally clueless that this goes on. In fact, oftentimes you'll hear white Americans specifically claim that they don't see color, that race doesn't exist to them. Usually they rationalize this idea of colorblind sameness as a testament to how non-racist they truly are. But the truth is, colorblind sameness does not prevent racism. It promotes it by implying that it doesn't happen. Like the doctor who denies your illness after you provide a detailed history to him. Now, this is something I could opt to do as a white woman. Of course, I can pretend that race doesn't exist, because as a white person, it will never affect whether I get a job, whether I get arrested, whether I get accepted into a higher institution of learning. It's easy to ignore something that has no impact on my life. So what is my point? It's become glaringly obvious for me over time that despite our constant insistence that racial issues are Black issues, I think racism is actually a white issue. What I mean by that is it's an issue that white people created and ergo need to fix. Most white Americans tend to either blatantly ignore or lack knowledge and sensitivity to the historical mistreatment, discrimination, oppressions, liberations, rebellions, and triumphs of Black people. People of color are already very aware of the state of things in regards to their community. It is white people that need to educate themselves in order to assure that we are truly living up to our democratic promise of democracy for all. To me, it is a devastating injustice that I did not have to directly address race or its social consequences as a white woman until I chose to do so. Think for a second how most white people are so uncomfortable acknowledging that being white affords them the privilege of never having to engage with racism if they don't want to, while people of color have no choice but to be bombarded by it every single day, historically, and in the ways I talked about before. This is totally counterintuitive to ever reaching the unity that many of us claim we value to want. It's time for white Americans to step up their game and work towards the equity they claim to value so deeply. It's time to put our money where our mouths is, mine included, because at the end of the day, through colonialism, slavery, mass incarceration, and our ugly, complex history, it was white people that created racism, and so it's our responsibility to dismantle it. But pretending that that never happened is only doing a disservice, and it's not doing anything to fix it. So my point is that there are a couple of things that we need to do as white people if we want to stop being hypocrites and be the allies and anti-racists we claim we are. First, we need to acknowledge our history, and we need to insist an accurate representation of how our country was built. Like the doctor at the beginning of this presentation, we cannot understand our country's sickness of racism without knowing its history of illness. We need to learn as much as we possibly can about our past, because that is going to inform us of what we can do now to shift that sociocultural perspective. Research and read and do your best to understand in every way possible how racism is weaved into our day-to-day life, and stop accepting a condensed and edited version of history that denies what truly took place. Second, we need to accept that we are all prejudiced, and that our denial of our history is hardwired into us. We are bombarded by messages every single day that encourage us to think in a racist way. Take standards of beauty, for example. We are told over and over again, blonde hair, blue eyes, narrow nose, a damaging standard of Eurocentric beauty that fails to represent all people. So one by one, we need to try to identify those internalized prejudices and call ourselves on them. I encounter a lot of people that would rather deny this truth as a selfish preservation of their character, because it's not a warm and fuzzy feeling to realize that we have biases that are doing damage to other people. But the honest truth is, there is not a single white person that has not done something racist at some point in their life. Whether it was telling a black person that they speak well, implying that the expectation is that they wouldn't, or seeing a black male and immediately being afraid. It's time to own it, examine it, and be reflexive. No amount of guilt will change what's already happened, but if we can all come to terms with the fact that we are all internally racist, the shame goes away, and then we could get to the crux of actually doing something about it. We should be talking about it, not trying to hide it. Lastly, and most importantly, is we need to listen to people of color when they tell us their stories. This does not mean seek people of color out to tell us how it is. We all have Google, we all can read. It's not the responsibility of the oppressed to teach their oppressor how to dismantle a system that was not created by them. That is our responsibility. But when a narrative is offered, we must listen. A great example of this is when we abjectly denied a lot of young black people's accounts of police brutality. Again, this goes back to an understanding of history. While yes, there are fabulous police officers, historically, there has been a cornucopia of documentation of how policing was a tool to oppress people of color. Instead of denying that, we should be listening to explore how we can make things better. So if this presentation has made you uncomfortable, good. That means it's working. If you find yourself getting defensive or getting angry, take a moment and ask yourself why, and take it as an opportunity to be reflexive and grow. Understand that being an anti-racist will not make you popular. I've been on the receiving end of hatred, excommunication, and nearly violent vitriol, especially as a white anti-racist, simply for asking people to listen and consider people of color's point of view. I've been called a radical and mocked, when at the end of the day, all I'm asking is that we assure that we live up to our democratic promise of equal rights for all, which I don't think is such a radical idea. I've had plenty of people ask me why, as a white person, I care, and I challenge them as to why they don't. Why don't they care about justice? because no amount of backlash I receive will ever surmount to the pain and suffering Black people have had to endure because of a history and everyday racism. Remember that it is never good enough to simply have good intentions. It's always your impact that matters the most at the end of the day. Thank you.